you to be here for that. Now, Philippe JUVIN, I'm going to give you the floor to talk to us about the state of play on concessions. We have Mr. PANZERI here. We have Mr. Hatzimakakis for Mr. BUŠOI. We have Mrs. RÜHLE. I will say a few words on behalf of my group. So let's see how we're proceeding on concessions. I give you the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, we're to take stock on the compromise amendments and the discussion on the shadows on concessions. Several hundred been tabled, plus 236 that I had in my draft report, so we're up to a good 1,000. So I'd like to thank the shadows for their contribution and their constructive approach that we've seen to date. And the discussions, I think, are going well, despite differences of opinion. I think it's well to say that. Of course, there are diametrically opposed positions. Nevertheless, people are showing, making smart choices, and we're pushing towards agreements. We've had 3 shadows meetings before the draft report, then 6 before the compromise amendments, and yesterday as well. That's why you won't see the complete updated version of all of the compromise amendments that are up for discussion, because we were discussing some yesterday. That's not reflected on the website. And then we had also questions with staff that they helped us with on technical on the technical front. We want to have a clear, legible, light touch legislative framework which is pragmatic and practicable, based on a text which will guarantee transparency, non-discrimination, establishment of practice to avoid abuse, while recognising and guaranteeing the needs of flexibility and leeway for public authorities in the choices they make. And the second issue was that of European added value in the text, to clarify concepts, to underscore the specificity of the concession vis-à-vis procurement contracts, and also to make sure it's light touch enough for economic operators and public authorities. So at the moment, 114 compromise amendments are on the table. There are others that are still the subject of discussion. Yesterday, most notably, we discussed a number, and we have reached agreement on many of them. I'll go through them very quickly without going into too much detail. First of all, on reorganisation, clarification, simplification of the text in a general sense, the compromises that we've struck, trying to clarify and simplify the directive, making the text more legible, this famous light touch approach. We've got rid of quite a lot of stuff, copy and paste on procurement, and we've tried to compensate out various bits and balance them. It's true, it's a complex text, it's a complex subject, and it remains a complex subject. Yesterday, once again, we had a discussion on the lack of light touch, lightness, if you like, in the text that we've achieved. But I know that perfection may well exist somewhere. The first concern of the shadows was that. The second main topic was the definition of concessions and related aspects. On definitions, we managed to clarify the definitions to differentiate most notably between concessions and procurement, on risk transfer, on the scope there, once again, a great deal of clarification was necessary because we found a lot of, in inverted commas, concessions which weren't in member states. For example, licenses that have been provided, administrative licenses, a lot of subjects which have actually disappeared because they're not covered, because they're not genuine concessions according to the scope. The length of application, we said that concessions need to be limited in time and on the amortizement of investments and the calculation of the value of the contracts. We redefined the definition of value, maybe first of all by making the value identical to for services and other aspects covered by concessions. Simplification here, once again, trying to find an economic logic in this. On the thresholds, the 2 lines of reasoning, first of all, was that we should have works and services should have the same thresholds. There should be equality there. That's the first principle. and we wanted to raise the threshold from 5 to 8 million. There's still an ambiguity there, which it's pending resolution there, and with the Commission, we know that there may be some problems there with procurement, as it happens as well on international contracts, but the idea is to have the same thresholds. Third aspect is sketching out the main principles in the directive. Political affirmation of the freedom of the public authorities. That's something that was very important. The second principle is that of transparency. These contracts need to be transparent without bringing into question any problems of confidentiality. Third principle, the freedom to define services of general economic interest and the way in which these services are organised. That is underscored in the text. Fourth main principle is the freedom of negotiation for the public authorities to work on their negotiating approach. They're free to define the way they approach this and way they organise it. Of course, that's within a framework that's set out, but we put that at the centre of the discussions. They must be free to negotiate on future concessions, contracts, and finally, of course, respect of equality of treatment and non-discrimination. On the exclusions, we picked up on the Commission's exclusions and added some exclusion set out in national legislation on exclusive domains, because there's no competition, because by law there can't be, so you can have to exclude them. On procedural guarantees, there once again we picked up on the Commission's ideas with an intent to improve on them, most notably all refusion of any measures to bring about artificial competition. On social and environmental aspects, of course, controversial issue from the outset, but the compromise that we struck in this area, I think, is a sensible one, which will guarantee respect of national legislation, also European and international, on environment and labour laws as well, on the basic principles, but also in cases of excluding candidates. So that was the idea behind that in the text. On governance, on procurement, we tried to do some cross-references there. We had a discussion with the shadows yesterday, that's why it's not on paper yet, to look at governance and try and extend that, and also looking at having a new article to stop having a sort of ping-pong between the classic procurement directive. And then Article 11 was a subject of discussion yesterday, which was something we wanted to reach an agreement on. Article 11 was redefined, reclarified, if you like, with the obvious necessity to have a new article for Article 11, or rather taking Article 50 and reforming it, which will allow transitional measures to go on for a fairly long period of time for those authorities who so wish to adopt not their structures, because that's not the point, but their legal setup, with the possible establishment of a legal entity which will allow them to provide certain services, continue providing those services, which is of high quality. Article 15, very important, public-public approach. As with procurement, I'm turning to Mr. Tarabella here, it's been subject of long discussion. We have had an agreement that's on the horizon, adapted from the procurement to suit concessions, and a fundamental point that hasn't been sorted out, and really this is a nub of the issue, and it's percentage of turnover justifying exclusion. Some people want 100%, some want 80%, and you've got the whole spectrum in between those two. We haven't reached an agreement. Of course, we can put that to a vote. Obviously, we have to take our political responsibilities in that way as well. So hopefully these compromise amendments will be done and dusted fairly soon. There's just 2 points, Chairman, that I'd like to mention now. When it comes to the difficulties we're facing on specific subjects, at the outset we're going to try and find general rules. And taking that approach, we realise it would be too difficult. If you're going to have a general rule that you're creating to regulate specific problems, then you're just generating actually more problems. Over the last couple of months, we changed tack and looked at specific questions to try and find a specific answer, whether it be transitory in nature or permanent, without wanting to completely change the text. But that was a different tack, as I say. Once again, I'd like to thank the shadows for their constructive exchange of views. Once again, it's difficult, it's a complex issue. We started off with positions very divergent a few months ago, and we've nevertheless managed to reach agreement on a great number of points. I'd like to thank them. I'd like to thank the Commission services, Internal Market Services, who have provided excellent support, and the European Commission. We haven't always agreed with the Commission. I'd like to thank the committee services as well. They've helped us a lot. But with the Commission, you know, there have been some clarifications. They've helped us out there. I'd also like to thank Mr. Tarabella, because even if Mr. Tarabella isn't working on the concessions text per se, he's shadowing this, if you like, through being the procurement rapporteur. And I think there are a number of common approaches we've been able to take. And also the added value at the end of this text is putting an end to different interpretations and practices, which sometimes are abusive practices, lack of transparency and discriminatory. We have come a long way, and after a year of deciphering, listening and dialogue, we have done a job of work which I think is quite considerable.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I agree with you that we've made huge progress on this dossier, and thank you for your leadership. And I'm also pleased to welcome Mark Tarabella here as well. I know it's not his item today, but we've had long meetings yesterday as well in preparation for the second round of votes on the Utilities Directive, also in 2 weeks' time. I forgot also to mention, and I apologise for not mentioning Joanna Szyszkowska, who's here from the Commission, who's been following this dossier very closely, and I hope we'll have time for a short contribution from her as well. Now, let's just hear from the shadows on the Concessions Directive, and so I'm pleased to give the floor first of all to Mr. PANZERI.
Grazie Presidente, sarò breve.
Thank you. I would also like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. JUVIN, for his presentation of the compromises and indeed for all the work he's done. A few points I'd like to repeat. First of all, it's important to have an agreement on the proposal, first and foremost, because concessions and public procurement are a decisive investment area in member states and in local authorities too. These compromises are the fruit of very hard work over the past few months, and they concretise an approach that will enable us to substantially simplify the document. Without getting down to detail, there are a couple of points I'd like to dwell on. The first is Article 1, scope of application. This has been changed. We want to assert the principle of administrative autonomy, and at the same time, because I think there's still a lot of members who really don't want to understand this aspect fully, the principle of the freedom of defining services of general economic interest. Now, these are important points, and we have our amendments and have enabled us to reach an important agreement, because in defining the principle of these services, we do not, or the directive does not attack or encroach upon the autonomy of national, regional or local authorities and the way they organise and finance. These are their prerogatives still. Another important point is Article 2 on definitions. It's clearer now. And in particular, the serious economic risk is better defined. Then Article 7 on social services, important too. Particular attention is focused on this type of services. And Article 26, too, which is one of the key points as far as we are concerned, because it was at the heart of all negotiations, and it now has a clear reference to environmental and social services, and it's of fundamental importance to ensure that the environmental rules applicable are actually applied. Then there's also the need not to contravene international agreements, union, EU law and national law, in particular with regard to collective bargaining agreements. And of course the subcontracting issue comes up here, one that we have worked very hard on. and try to find the right way of dealing with it. So there's a number of points that the rapporteur has already dealt with, and we won't be going back to those because the results will certainly enjoy full support from our side. A few comments very briefly to conclude. There are aspects of fundamental importance in which we have not yet been able to set out a path towards compromise. The first of these is public-public cooperation, and the other is affiliated companies in sectors which require special treatment or exceptions because of their nature. So what we have done is taken a few steps forward, and I very much hope that what we do in the next few hours on these points will enable us to take further steps forward so that we can submit a compromise solution within the scheduled time so that we can meet all the requirements that have been put to us. So up to now, I think we can say that it's a very positive job that's been done. I'd like to thank once again the rapporteur, and I hope that in the next few days we'll get it all done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for your optimistic conclusion, which I think, though I do think that's right. Now, Mr. Chatzimarkakis is going to speak for Mr. BUŞOI.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I would like to speak on behalf of Mr. BUŞOI, who would like to thank the Commission for the proposal for a regulation, as well as Mr. JUVIN for the amendments proposed in the draft opinion in order to further improve the text. We have to learn the lessons from the financial crisis and also restore the confidence of consumers in the capacity of retail investors in the financial markets. The condition to do so is to increase the transparency and to inform them properly about the investment. Cristian BUŞOI supports most of the compromises reached as they improve the text by adapting to the specificities of concessions as compared to public contracts when it comes to issues like duration, renegotiation, technical specifications, award criteria, etc., but also by simplifying it, which brings us closer to a light touch directive as promised by the Commission. Mr. BUŞOI is pleased that a good compromise was found on the definition of the notion of concession, which generated a significant amount of case law. He also welcomes the new article on the principle of free administration by public authorities, which clarifies that public authorities are entirely free to provide works or services themselves or through a concession, according to what they think is best. Concerning the thresholds and the method used for the calculation of the value of a concession, it is very good that the text is rationalized and significantly simplified. The ALDE shadow believes that the value of a concession should indeed be calculated on the basis of the total turnover accumulated over the concession period, net of taxes. He also welcomes the elimination of the intermediary threshold of 2.5 million. However, he doesn't think that raising the general threshold to 8 million euros instead of 5, as the Commission has proposed, is a good idea. In many member states, 8 million is a lot of money, which would result in excluding from competition a lot of contracts which, if they were to be awarded in another member state, would be included in the scope of the directive. Apart from this, such a move may conflict with international agreements concluded by the Union. A satisfactory compromise has been reached also on the exclusions from the scope of the directive. We managed to adopt a balanced approach and avoid transforming this directive into an empty nutshell with limited added value. An important element of this directive for Cristian BUŞOI is the affiliated undertakings exemption and the in-house. While these exemptions are justified for obvious reasons, Mr. BUŞOI thinks that they should be strictly construed so that we avoid competition distortions by directly awarding concession contracts to entities which are otherwise in competition with private undertakings on the open market. Mr. BUŞOI would therefore have liked to see the affiliated undertakings exemption limited to contracts awarded by contracting entities which are not contracting authorities. As currently worded, the text doesn't provide for a sufficient differentiation between in-house and the affiliated undertakings exemption, whereas the criteria are stricter for in-house. Concerning the in-house exemption, the ALDE Group considers that we should stick to the 90% concerning the activities that the controlled legal persons has to carry out for the controlling authority or entity in order to qualify for this exemption. This is something that the ALDE Group has defended also in the Public Procurement Directive. Moreover, in the criteria for joint control of a legal person, Mr. BUŞOI believes that it is important that the latter does not pursue any interests which are distinct from those of the controlling public authorities. The identity of the interests is what actually justifies such an exemption. Speaking about conflicting interests enlarges the scope of the exemption, which is not appropriate. Mr. BUŞOI welcomes also the compromise on the duration of a concession and especially the fact that performance objectives would now be taken into account whether investments are involved or not. The provisions on transparency and procedural guarantees have been significantly simplified, and a larger degree of flexibility is now given to public authorities in organizing the procedure while guaranteeing the equal treatment of candidates and tenderers. Mr. BUŞOI is also pleased that an agreement has been found to replace technical specifications by technical and/or functional requirements, which is more adapted to the reality of concessions and which will also encourage innovation by concessionaires. Last but not least, since we talk about long-term contracts where renegotiation is rather the rule than the exception, it is important to provide for more flexibility in the renegotiation without a new award procedure. The compromise provides for a clearer definition of what is a substantial modification which contributes to this objective. To conclude, even if the text doesn't reflect entirely Mr. BUŞOI's and also the ALDE's views on this text, we believe that it is important to keep in mind the significant improvement that the rapporteur together with the shadows has brought to this directive. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hatzimakakis, on behalf of Cristian BUŞOI, who's been very active on this directive also. Mrs. RÜHLE.
Vielen Dank, Herr Harbour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harbour, and special thanks to Mr. JUVIN, quite explicitly, because this will be the last debate, and I'd like to thank him for his patience with those who didn't share his opinion and his willingness to always look for compromise, and in particular for his very professional way he conducted the negotiations. We've really succeeded in simplifying this Commission proposal, making it leaner, and giving it the flexibility that's needed, or keeping the flexibility that's needed. So I support most of the compromises, most of them anyway, not all of them, I'm afraid. There's one point I need to correct here. We won't support the compromises on Articles 11 and 15 and on the transitional period, and let me just explain why. I want to stress that we would have preferred not to have a directive at all. The directive is likely to simply create more problems than it solves in some areas, but you know our position, and I'm not going to explain why we thought that some areas should be left out. I'm thinking in particular of the services of general economic interest. I'm also thinking of water, for example. We probably wouldn't get a majority on those, so we'll have to accept things the way they are. Thanks to Mr. JUVIN for being willing to deal with rescue services and disaster services in general, find a solution there, a good thing, and we support it. But the main reason why we won't be able to vote for the report at the end of the day, I'm afraid we're going to have to vote against it, and the problem is public-public cooperation. Unlike the previous speaker, I really think that given the economic and financial crisis we're going through, the big debt burden on public authorities, it would really need urgently to make more effective, the public sector more effective, and to more flexible and allow for synergies. So public-public cooperation could give us 30% more synergy, and that 30% is something that we really need now in the situation in most of our member states. And in fact, we need it urgently. It's not just, that water is a German problem, as people often say. It's not true. It's a problem in a lot of member states. There's a lot of member states where we have public and private tenderers on the same market, and some have fully privatised, others, most of them in fact mixed. Some are fully private, some are fully public, but mostly they're mixed. And therefore this shows that that kind of cooperation is possible and the public sector can do a good job. Yes, of course, we can't rule out private participation altogether. There's also questions of control bodies and so on, but it really boils down to the definition. And I think that the definition is based on false criteria. That was a problem in Mr. Tarabella's report, and it's got worse now. We abstained. We didn't vote for Mr. Tarabella's report, and I'm afraid we're going to have to vote against Mr. JUVIN's. Let me explain why. If 80% of total turnover for the local authority concerned, that's going to cause problems, because most public cooperation doesn't cover just one area, but perhaps, for example, water plus energy. Now, we've looked at the energy sector, and it's been liberalised to a great extent, so there are requirements relating to procurement there, but it covers a lot more than 80%, and if we do the same thing for water, that's not going to work. Water will have to be 100%. And that's a real difficulty, because water, of course, will have to be modernised. The supply of water, getting rid of wastewater, treatment of wastewater, and this is urgent. And whether we're talking about small or large local authorities, we need a better method to cover this. So this is going to be jeopardised because of this. This directive will not require privatisation of the water industry, but what it will do is make it a lot more difficult for a lot of local authorities to abide by the requirements, and then there's going to be a problem with legal certainty. And then maybe you should think about whether it's not better to rule water out of the scope of this directive to avoid these problems. I think it's a problem, and that's why we're not going to vote for this report, but vote against it. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Just very brief words for me, just in my capacity as a shadow for this directive, as I have been also for the other public procurement directives. From our side, I very much appreciated the approach that Philippe JUVIN has taken, because we've had to make some fundamental changes to the original proposal in order to essentially, I think, make it genuinely now add value in terms of the legislative proposals on the table, which I think a number of people had doubts at the beginning whether we needed a separate directive. As we've gone through shaping this, I've become more convinced this is going to be helpful. I think it will provide clarity, and I think it will encourage the development of concessions, which I think are an extremely important additional tool that's available for public authorities in deciding how they wish to manage public services in future. But of course, the nature of concessions is that they are much more complex. They are higher value. They are higher value agreements. They last for longer periods. They're going to be subject to negotiation in order to ensure that the performance of the concessionaire, the service delivery is going to be continue to respond to technological, market and other developments. And so they are of their nature complex and sophisticated contracts, and they're also of a very wide variety. And I think therefore we've been working hard with Mr. JUVIN to make sure that the regulation does not represent any unrealistic constraints. And in that respect, I understand the sensitivity, particularly about one sector, as Mrs. RÜHLE has eloquently pointed out. But of course, there are many countries where water is subject to a concession agreement, and therefore we do have to have I think, an overall agreement that covers that as well. So we've been pleased about the work, very pleased about the work that Mr. JUVIN has done. We've contributed to the compromise proposal. I think we have a good package on the table. I think the only thing that we may need to look at after the vote is whether some elements of this are still not entirely appropriate to concessions. In other words, I think there's potential for further simplification, but I think this is rather at the detail level and not about the fundamentals of the proposal. And we are happy to go along also with the threshold of the proposal as set out at the moment. So we will be voting in favour of the compromises and in favour of the directive. Good. Now, Mrs. Tchaikovsky is here. Did you want to just... Mrs. Verheyen, sorry, you caught my eye. Mrs. Verheyen.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also, I would like to express my great thanks for the excellent cooperation with Mr. JUVIN. A lot of the recommendations from the committee were built into the compromises, and it was well done. So it's... You know, those of us who aren't actually shadows hadn't seen this until yesterday, so it's been very difficult to say what we think about the more detailed points. Perhaps Ms. Verheyen would speak into the microphone, please. I think it's important, although there are differences between the member states, it has an impact on the limit values. Thank you. We've, obviously it's very important. There's a lot of personnel involved in this, and that it's very important because there are different threshold values from one member state to another, and I think it's important where personnel costs may rise above, may take contracts above that level. So I think that we should ensure that we get as high as possible a threshold value in this in light of international law. Then there's also the issue of interlocal authority cooperation. We need to think about the crisis, the fact that we're in a crisis when we look at this, and we've got to ensure that local authorities are able, and all public authorities are able, to invest in the most useful way possible, not to build unnecessary facilities, and I think that that's very important, and that we should provide every facilitation to ensure that that can actually happen. That applies to the articles on cooperation. The in-house projects as well, or in-house procurement, you need to be sure about what's the intention behind the document and what's not intended, because of course when the member states come to deal with it, they may not all interpret things in the same way. Obviously, in some cases you have it's all local authority. In other cases, it's a mix, and you have things like water, gas supply, and so on. And there's difficulties if you leave these things. Maybe it's better to leave these things out of the scope of application because there are always different interpretations. For example, in the liberalised energy sector, so. For that reason, I'd like clarification in the compromise to the effect that where a service is to be provided entirely within the borders or the boundaries of a local authority, that creates a different situation, obviously, and that needs to be allowed for in the directive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Verheyen, and I know that you've been much involved in this, and also thank you for your contributions to the discussion. Right, I don't think anyone else wants to speak, so Mrs. Tchaikovsky, very briefly, please, because we have our panel of experts here for the next item. Mrs. Tchaikovsky.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and also all the best for the new year from the concessions team. Let me thank, on behalf of the Commission, the rapporteur and the shadows for the work that has been done so far. We very much appreciate progress and results of this work. As said already on previous occasions, we do consider that indeed the text has been significantly simplified and streamlined, but we do believe that main principles and the logics of the proposal as submitted by the Commission is still preserved, so we are very happy with that. Nevertheless, I would like to make 4 comments or focus on 4 points which we do consider as important and draw the attention of the committee to possible consequences. In the first place, the scope of the directive. We noticed that indeed further exemptions have been added from the application of the directive, including gambling sector, and the Commission considers that it's difficult to find reasons for such an exemption. We do recognize that it has been the case, has been decided by the shadows and the rapporteur, but we have difficulties to understand reasons for exempting gambling sector. In the same vein, I would like to stress that the Commission doesn't see any reason to exclude any further sector of activity in any member state. We do not find any legal or economic justification for temporary or full exemption of any such sector. And we do understand that there are different rules applicable to different activities, but the objective of this directive is to indeed offer the common minimum denominator precisely because such rules and practices are not always in line with principles of transparency and equal treatment. The second point concerns thresholds. As had been said on the occasion of the discussion on the reform and previously here, we have to take into account international obligations in that respect and in particular GPA, and any departure from the threshold established there will have impact on the obligations of the EU vis-à-vis partners from third countries. On Article 15, even though the text has not been suggested, I only would like to point to one thing. The Commission does understand the importance of public-public cooperation. However, as it has been framed by the Court on many occasions, and it has been very specifically stressed by the Court, that in particular private participation in the context of public-public cooperation is not possible. And we would very much appreciate if this criterion is recognized in the further work. Last but not least, let me draw your attention to one point on the awards criteria and procedure. It might be a matter of wording, but indeed, given that this article, these provisions have been very significantly reformulated, we see some risks that not all the bidders would be treated in a non-discriminatory and equal manner in the course of the procedure, and maybe such issues could be clarified further on in the process of debate. Otherwise, as I said, we very much appreciate the work that has been done, and we are at the disposal of the committee for any further comments. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed for that cooperation, and I think the results are already working through, and what I think we will eventually get a very good proposal. Mr. JUVIN, did you wish to make any closing remarks?
Bon, merci, Monsieur le Président. Moi, très rapidement, chacun s'est exprimé.
Well, very briefly, Chairman, everyone's had a chance to speak. There are differences of opinion, of course, between members and the Commission on some topics. That's what democracy is all about. If Parliament does finally adopt the text, I think we can be pleased with what we do if it goes through after the Commission has dealt with it, because we will really have put together a legislative text. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman.
Good. Well, thank you everyone very much. And just to remind you that the vote is going to be on the 24th of January. So the next meeting of this committee is going to be a very intensive voting sessions, and I know that you will all be well prepared for that. But there will be some final work to be done, I think, next week in Strasbourg on all these key dossiers. So thank you very much indeed. Now, we now move on to